Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and welcome to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I am Chris Acton. Kathy Group is not able to join us today, so I will be your host. Today's episode of Textiles and Tea is sponsored by the Olympia Weavers Guild. Thank you so much for your support and your sponsorship. We welcome your questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the program. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button and don't use the chat button. The Q&A is the way to go. So today we are having tea with Nolan Wright. Nolan Wright is a fiber artist who uses coiling and knotting to make sculptural basketry forms, working with pine needles, waxed linen thread, other cords, and copper wire. His work has been selected for several national juried exhibits, including Art Evolved Intertwined, co-sponsored by the National Basketry Association and Studio Art Quilt Associates, and touring the United States through the end of 2026. Nolan's work points to the juxtaposition of shapes, textures, and colors that catch his eye in the world around him as the inspiration for his work. Not that he tries to recreate any specific object or scene, it is more that they resonate with something inside him at an emotional level as well as aesthetically. And he sees their influence in the materials he chooses and what happens as he works on a piece. Each the result of a slow, organic, almost meditative process. So welcome, Nolan, to Textiles and Tea. Hi, I'm so glad you're here.
Chris. Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see you.
Good, good, good. So we're going to start with the hard-hitting questions. What is your favorite tea?
Market Spice, which is Ice Place Market in Seattle. It's a really pungent, heavy cinnamon orange.
Nice. Do you drink it hot or chilled?
Hot. So not during the summer in South Carolina. In South Carolina, totally. Summers, now that I'm a Southerner, it's sweet tea.
Oh yeah, see, I was kind of hoping you'd say sweet tea because it's one of my favorites. Once I'm south of Kentucky, that's always my tea of choice. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's just start from the top, Nolan. How did you get started in fiber?
Well, I grew up kind of surrounded by a lot of crafted things, including Native American basketry, African basketry, masks. My mom was a designer, did a lot of silk screen work, fashion design, draperies. She'd been a printmaker and painter, and she opened a little gallery selling her work and friends' work. And then wherever they traveled, she would pick the best examples of craft from that country, that community, and the gallery just grew. It was Berta Wright and Associates was the name of it in Tucson, Arizona. So that was just sort of the background, just sort of the environment that I was in. And then seeing collections at the Heard Museum in Phoenix and the archaeological collections, anthropological collections at the University of Arizona. But then in high school, my sister taught me some macrame knots.
Ooh, fun.
So that's what I guess more literally got me started in fiber. And I just kept making things. I enjoyed the physical process of the doing of it. There was something calming about the repetition of the knots and the freedom. Things would develop really slowly, and so there was time to react to it. And I think that's really, I think of that as one of my strengths. I'm not like, well, I'll just start working on something, and then once something starts to develop, then I have something to react to. And then Gail Wimmer, Weaver, came and started a fiber department at the University of Arizona in the mid-70s, and that's when I took my first formal fiber classes.
How wonderful. I love that you grew up, though, with such creative people in your house. That's awesome.
Yeah, it really was. My dad was a geologist and in early childhood education, but would collect wasp nests, sand, driftwood, coral, rocks. So between those kind of forms and the things that people had made, that's what we had all around us. There were no color televisions. There was very little in the way of traditional furniture, but there was a lot of art.
I love that. Well, and that totally ties into your sense of kind of found objects and all of that. I mean, that all makes sense then, Nolan.
Yeah.
Very nice. So I know you've talked about your work have an organic kind of quality to it. Can you talk about how you think of that word in relationship to your art?
Well, I think of it both in terms of the objects that result, that when I see them, many of them, I like to think look like something that just grew. They look like something that natural forces caused to happen. And then there's also I think of it more, I guess, in terms of the process, because I rarely start with much of a definitive idea. I may have a way of starting that I want to try, or an initial shape, a gesture, but it's very much about seeing what unfolds and reacting to it. And so that's what I think of. And maybe I'm not using the word accurately, but I think of that as an organic kind of process.
No, I think that's brilliant because you kind of relate to that word on two different levels, which is wonderful, that kind of organic being natural, but also the process. No, I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. I love that. So I realize you've talked about kind of how you treat your work as kind of what inspires you and you kind of go from there. So it has a kind of spontaneous kind of element to it. Yeah. But do you have certain things that you have prepared beforehand? Do you have certain materials ready? What do you do to get ready to do a project?
Well, like I said, I'll often have a gesture in mind or in a way of starting, like whether I'm going to start by coiling or whether I'm going to start by knotting and then integrate the pine needles. And then it's what mix of texture and color, what palette of texture and color. And I start gathering materials. I don't mean gathering the pine needles, but I've already had to do that. So that level of preparation has to take place earlier. Okay. And there's a certain amount of things that like I gather material, I'll gather different chords because they speak to me. But then when it's actually working on an individual piece, then it's like, okay, so I look through my stock material and put a palette together.
Nice. So you have kind of a loose idea going into it, but then you let the actual piece kind of tell you what it wants.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there have been a few, and it's been increasing a little bit more, where I'll have more of a concept. Like I had an idea for a piece where I envisioned sort of like a stone or a stump type shape. And then I saw that as being dark, and then greenish, another color, waffling, undulating forms coming out of the top of it, and then bursting out of the top of that, something in the pink, magenta, violet range. And I started trying to execute that. We're going to come to that piece later. But so
okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, so I started trying to execute, and I got to the second step, and it told me it was done. It just looked. Oh. So there are times where I'll have a concept in mind. I'll have a shape. I'll have even a whole. It's not quite seeing the finished piece, but kind of the gestalt of it and the emotional impact of it that I wanted to have. And sometimes I end up with something very different. Yeah. Sometimes I end up with what I thought that emotional impact would be, but I get there a different way than I thought I was going to. I haven't yet done a piece where I had a concept, thought I had the whole shape and executed it, and it was what I started out in my mind thinking it was going to look like.
That's part of the fun of the journey, though, isn't it? It's kind
Yes.
of, you never know how it's gonna end up.
Yeah.
Yeah, how wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about breaking containment and canyon country. Can you talk about how these are related, kind of how a discovery from a previous project helped to inspire these different pieces?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with Canyon Country on the right because that was earlier. And that's one of the larger pieces I've done. I think that's about 24 inches wide, 8-9 inches tall.
Wow.
And I was really still very much learning, well, I'm still learning, but I was earlier in the process of learning what the needles could do, how much I could torque the shape, how much I could twist it. And as I was working on it, and as those shapes started to develop, I started seeing topography. It felt like canyons that I had hiked in the Southwest around Tucson where I'd grown up, but I felt like there was additional topography that was needed. And I don't know if the viewers can really tell looking at it on the screen, but the darker areas where the color is all knotted. So we have a base of pine needle coiling, and then there are knotted forms that are created in several different parts of the object. And I wasn't sure it was successful at the time. I'm still not sure that it was particularly successful. The knotting seemed like it was kind of heading in a direction that I thought was interesting, but I wasn't sure that it really got there.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure that it worked as a whole. And I'm going to do a little toss back to the question about getting the fiber and influences. My mom one time looked at a piece I was working on and she said, "This is fascinating what you've done here. And this is fascinating what you've done there. And you could teach me these techniques." And I couldn't do it. But I can still step back and look at the whole and tell you it doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? I can't tell you, I'm not sure. It doesn't work overall as a design, as an overall impact of the piece. And that really stayed with me. And so as I'm working on pieces, I get just enmeshed in the doing of it. And there are lots of little fascinating things to me, anyway, that happen as I'm knotting or coiling. But I don't always know that the whole piece works as a totality. And so I took away from that if I was going to do knotting, if I was going to integrate the knotting, that it really needed to be integrated, and I need to be more mindful about how the two work together. I don't really have a lot more to say about it than that. The one on the left is newer. That was one of the early pieces really working with a lot of color. And that piece started with knotting and then grew out into the coiling. And I left some of the chords from where you see the color against the dark brown.
Mm-hmm.
So as the color spills out onto the coiling, the color is executed by continual coiling, by closed coiling instead of open coiling. Where you see the brown on either side, that's open coiling, where you see the needles. And I left some of the cords from the closed coiling hanging out of the back, so where you wouldn't see them now, with the idea, well, I'm going to do something with them. I'm going to integrate, I'm going to do some more knotting on the outside, and you can't really see a lot of the knotting on the outside except here on the right where you see the gray. And again, I wasn't sure that worked. So that was another experience of letting things happen in an organic way, but also trying to have a design eye, at least in terms of an idea of how the whole worked, and coming away from the experience not sure that it did, and kind of filing that away to think more about how I was working with the material, and not to just not to just leave cords. It was easy enough to add cords if there was an area where I wanted to add knotting on the outside or on the inside of a vessel form. And that there are limits sometimes. If you just leave things to chance and to spontaneity, that doesn't always work.
Right.
It may not be as pleasing as you'd like.
Yeah, no, I love so many things you just said. First of all, just to back up the idea of the canyon piece, I think that one has so much dimension to it. And I love your comment just about that you weren't sure the whole thing worked together, while individual parts of it were brilliant. You liked them, you know, separately, but as a whole piece. I think that's so true. Every artist has experienced that, where you have bits and pieces that you really enjoy, but does it all talk to each other as one complete piece? I think that's wonderful, Nolan. Very good. All right, so let's wander in to talk about color study and fine expectations. These show how you incorporate your dyeing and painting into your work. Do you dye your materials for specific projects, or do you dye for general supply needs? By the way, I love the colors in these. I'm a color girl, so these are just so, they're so compelling to me. I love these, yeah.
These are two that I like a lot. These are two that I felt were pretty successful. And the answer to the short answer to your question is both. I'll dye needles just to have a base of supply. I'll also dye needles for a particular piece. I'll paint needles for supply. After I'll do a large dye bath. For instance, here I did on the one on the left, color study, I did a dye bath of olive, but it was not just, well, there's no red olive dye. I mean, so it was a mix of a number of different colors. And then I pulled some of those needles to do this piece and wanted to really experiment with working with the acrylic paint. And I painted those needles for this piece. Nice. So I chose those colors as accents to the olive, and with an idea that was going to be used together. But I ended up having a lot more that I had painted than I needed for the piece, and a lot more of the olive needles than I needed for the piece. And that became, you know, that went into a couple of other pieces that I ended up making later. So I'll end up with a supply of needles that I may have just done in advance, not for any particular work. I'll end up with part of the supply will be needles that were left over from a particular project that were done for that project. The one on the right, Defying Expectations, has very little paint. There's very little needles there. That's almost entirely from dye.
Wow.
That was just pulling from the supply. That piece started as just I hadn't done anything in over a year, and busy packing, getting ready to retire from the job I had and moved to South Carolina. And I just was practicing the oval start, and I did the base and started turning up, and it was like, okay, well, now what? And when I started, I was just using undyed needles because it was just practice. And then I just started integrating yellow from the yellow dye bath, and then some orange and different colors, and then just started progressing through the color. And then it was like, okay, well, let's play with the cantilevering shapes as the progression of color goes up. So that's, I don't know, did I answer your question?
You totally did, yes. And I think that completely makes sense, that you dye and color your materials in both scenarios, that you would have some on hand, but you also have times for a specific project when you're like, you know what I need here, and then bring in those materials, dye or paint those materials as you need them. That completely makes sense.
Well, and especially since the way I work, since I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Yeah. I don't know how many needles I'm going to need. And so if I'm dyeing in advance, painting in advance, I'm going to do more than I'm going to need for the work, because I don't want to run out and then having to do a new dye bath or new paints that don't match, don't integrate well.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll just say this as a little asterisk. Every project that I've done just to kind of get the muscles warmed up, none of them look as good as yours. That was amazing. I can't believe you're just like, oh, I'm just going to get back into it. That's stunning. That's really beautiful. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I have a note here. It says you are a fiber studio assistant at Aeromont School of Arts and Crafts.
Yeah,
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience there? That sounds very cool, by the way.
thanks. Well, Gail Wimmer, the woman who started the fiber department at the University of Arizona, submitted an application in my name for me to be an assistant without
Thank you.
telling me, without
What,
telling
without
me,
telling you?
without telling me, without asking me. And then she said, what are you doing this summer? And I said,
way.
I don't know yet. And she said, well, I'm glad you don't have plans because you're going to Aramont. And so that was, Gatlinburg, Tennessee in 1977 or 1978. It was pretty tiny compared to what it is now.
Okay.
And it was amazing. There were the other assistants back then. They had an assistant for, so like there was an assistant in the textile department, there was an assistant in the fiber department, wood, etc. And we were there for the summer. I think their assistants now are briefer. So I was there for a number of different instructors. And I didn't really know what to expect. The first instructor was from the Northeast. We had a show up of our work. All the assistants had a big show up, which was very cool. And I asked him to give me a critique. And I'd only had a couple of critiques, in Gail's studio, and she was very, nurturing is not the right word. She would push, but it was nothing like what this fellow did. He walked through, looked at the pieces and said, well, I can't tell. Why do you keep designing things to be 10 times as big as you execute them? I didn't know that I was doing that. This is back before pine needles. I was doing large wall hanging, knotted pieces, sculptural pieces that hung on the wall, and some that hung from the ceiling. And the other thing he said that really kind of blew my mind, he said, I can't tell if you knew what you wanted to say and knew that this was the technique and this was the material to best say that, or you happen to know these techniques and happen to have these materials lying around the studio. And that absolutely stopped me in my tracks, because it was like, you're supposed to be saying something.
What?
I didn't come from that tradition. I came from a craft tradition that was about the making, and it was about the material and the exploring. And then the idea that I was supposed to be saying something and the pieces were supposed to be much bigger. Well, how am I supposed to do that? In what studio? And when I thought about, well, what things do I want to say? The things that came to my mind at that relatively young age, not too long after Vietnam, were, I wanted to make a piece that was about war, that you'd experience at the level of a bayonet stuck about a half an inch into your stomach, where you couldn't pretend it was something else. And the thought that those were the only things that I wanted to say if I was going to be saying something was a little intimidating. And within about a year, I think I had stopped work. I stopped work. I was doing construction work to help pay the bills. I stopped doing fiber, ended up moving, ended up belatedly going to college in my mid-20s and studying urban planning, and flew off into other
whole different direction.
Yeah. If I could go back, so if I could have a conversation with that guy now, if I'd had my wits about me then, I would have said, I have those materials in my studio because I gravitate to those materials. They speak to me. I know those techniques because they work for me, because the effects that they create resonate with something inside me. And that's good enough for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, but I think this is such an interesting thing, though, that you went through talking to this professor and hearing this kind of critique, because first of all, I personally, I always like it when people challenge you, but there are times when they challenge you and you come back to, you just become like more sure of yourself. Like it becomes one of those, okay, I've thought about what you said and I'll take some of that into consideration, but here is where I am. So I love that you kind of had time to really think about and explore what that meant for you.
It took a couple of decades.
Yeah. I understand that too. Yes. Yeah. Well, but I think that's such an interesting idea. The idea that your work is communicating, that they want your work to say something. So I think that's And I have to say, looking at your pieces though, your pieces have such a personality to them. I think you do a really nice job. And even if it's just a matter of, because of the way you construct it, and it is organic, and it is, it has that kind of natural kind of growth kind of feel to it. I think you really do a good job with it though. After all those years, you do a really good job.
Well, thanks. I think lately I've started thinking that there may have been a narrative there, but it wasn't a conscious one. When I look at the kinds of shapes that I've done, I don't know, I think we may have some pieces coming that I can use to talk about that more, but
Okay.
Yeah, I had a gallery owner who was talking about having a gallery show, who recently was visited my studio and was looking at pieces and talking about how she saw elegance in them, but it was that she thought that I was disrupting the elegance.
Ooh.
That I wasn't about, that my pieces weren't about capturing elegance, they were more about disrupting the elegance. And that really got me thinking. And I think she was onto something. I'm not, like, I can do a symmetrical piece, but once I've done it, I then feel a need to disrupt it and do more against it or do something to twist it.
You get off balance.
Yeah, and I think that well, the term that's used now for is neurodivergent on spectrum. And I think that part of my reality is, symmetrical. I appreciate beauty. I appreciate symmetrical shapes, but it doesn't feel quite right to me for it to come from my hand. It's like it needs to get a little gnarly. It needs to get a little twisted. That's more in keeping with my lived experience. And I think that tracks back to that aspect of who I am. And I don't know whether narrative is the right word for that, or where I go with that if it is. It's not as literal a thing as talking about race or talking about something, other kinds of issues in work. How do you talk about neurodivergence visually?
Yeah.
And make that part of a visual statement as well as maybe an artist statement. It's one, I can add it to my artist statement.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of doing that, but anyway, I got off on a tangent.
No, I love the tangent. I think it's awesome. And I love the fact that you said it needs to be more gnarly. That's just such a perfect word. And the whole disrupting elegance, that's a great way to describe kind of a certain approach to it, that perfect isn't interesting, like that kind of idea that it needs to have other things happening. So but I think exactly how the picture you just painted, when you look at your work, that's exactly, I think you have, you're able to portray that in your work really beautifully. It really translates well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's pull up, let's look at Vortex and Unexpected Growth. On the left is Vortex, correct, Nolan? Is that Vortex?
Yeah.
On the, okay,
Yep.
This is one of your earlier pieces, and on the right is Unexpected Growth, which is newer. Yes, yeah. Can you talk about how your work is kind of compare these two for us and talk about the differences?
Okay, well, Vortex was a really early piece, and it was like, can I do a perfect circle start?
Nice.
Once I had I'm practicing a circle start. And then it was, okay, well, now what? And so I was working with needles that I had, and it was, experimenting with adding different quantities and seeing how much additional texture I could get, and the spiral that came up out of that. You can't see it in this picture, but there are also needles added on the outside. And so it was very much exploring the physicality of doing it, the technique, seeing whether I could execute it. That's pretty much it.
Nice.
A real serious piece.
Yeah.
Unexpected Growth on the right is the one that I described, that I had set out to make earlier, with a kind of blobby bottom.
Yeah.
That was like a stone with lichen growing on it, or a stump, and then roughly foliage coming out of the top, and then it was going to have these much larger pink and violet and other kinds of shapes coming out of the top. When I got to the knotted portion that you see on the top done, when I got that portion done, I looked at it and it really felt a whole. I felt that that piece was done. It worked as a whole. It didn't need or want anything else. So this is much more sculptural, really kind of stepping away from vessel, working with more color. These are dyed and painted needles. Can't really see it very well in this image, but the coiling, the stitching is with multiple plies of different weight waxed linen and copper wire, colored copper wire. So,
wow.
You know,
Yeah.
this is moving. So this started as a circle bottom that I then punched out. I did nodules. I did things to twist it and take it away from the circle. But with the idea that it was going to have those larger pieces coming out of the top, I needed a big enough base that it wouldn't topple. And so I ended up being happy with that overall form without going further with that. But the pieces that were going to grow out of the top, I'm now in the process of making into another piece.
Oh, perfect. That's lovely. So Nolan, correct me, but these both kind of start the same way then, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those both start as a circle.
See, that's so
open coiled circle.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and your earlier one looks so much like it could have, you know, some apples in it. Like it has a real functional kind of look to it, where the other one is completely sculptural and has a certain kind of, has a different, very different kind of life to it. The two of them have a very different kind of energy.
Yeah, I'd say I've moved completely away from anything remotely approaching utilitarian.
Yeah. I love that. There are plenty of people out there that will make you a woven basket. We need you to do the sculptural stuff, Nolan. That's what we need. All right, so let's chat about, I think barnacles is next. Let's see, right? Let's talk about barnacles. So barnacles, if they'll pull it up for me, that would be awesome. Here we go. Look at this one. This is so cool. So kind of, can you talk about kind of the core kind of basket form and the adornment? I think there's so many interesting things happening here, Nolan. Can you kind of walk us through how it came to be?
Okay, this is another early one. This is about within a year of Vortex. And so again, like Canyon, and then Canyon Country was about a year after this.
Okay, that's good context. Thank you.
So exploring how to move, this started as an oval base, and then pushing a little nodule out from the side and letting that grow, and then exploring how to sort of torque that and twist, which led to the shelf. But all along as I was working on it, I was seeing, I had the idea in my mind when I first started it of a form that would have barnacles on it. I was thinking of sea forms. I was thinking of the Gulf of California, where my family had gone when we were kids with a craft group. The Arizona Designer Craft Association used to have an organizational getaway for a long weekend in Puerto Penasco, Rocky Point, in the Gulf of California. And so the tide pools and rock formations where you have barnacles growing on things, and fishing vessels that are in dry dock with barnacles on the side. And so I thought from the very beginning that I was going to be adding some knotted forms. There are more of them actually around on the other side than we can see. You can just see the bottom on the right-hand bottom corner. You can see a couple added. And inside, you can just see a little bit of the loose, these vertical, the little strand coming out inside. If the angle was a little different, if you saw in there, it'd be like a sea urchin. You'd see that there's a whole ball, a shape of those coming out. So that was something that was more of a spontaneous decision to do because it seemed in keeping with the piece. But the idea of the barnacles was something that I had intended to do from the beginning. And I've meant to get back to ever since. I want to do a much larger shape with loads and loads of barnacles.
Nice. I like that. I could see how the idea of barnacles completely fits in with so many of kind of the concept of your pieces. I think that this seems like a match made in heaven there. But thank you for walking us through that. It's interesting to kind of see it through your eyes, how it kind of started as an oval, which I would have never guessed, and how you progressed, how the piece evolved from there. That's wonderful.
Well, see, one thing I see, having started with knotting and coming to coiling later, any place, every stitch is a place where cords can be added.
Okay.
So once the stitching is in place, you can add cords, just looping them all around the stitch, around in between the stitches, and then use that as the base for knotting. So there's it just sort of invites layering. It invites building topography, building additional shapes, and things organically growing.
Now, Nolan, do you have a certain, when do you know it's done? When do you know a piece is finished? Is that a hard question? I know, I hate when people ask me those kind of questions. I was just
It's
curious.
fine.
If you
It's a good question. It's a good question. When I imagine adding to it and it doesn't make it better.
Ooh. Oh, that's a great answer.
That was something that Gail Wimmer taught us. She said, you know, when you're working with, like, she would do crits while we were still working on pieces.
Yeah.
And say, where do you think you're going? What materials are you considering adding? She would suggest, okay, take some of that material or that color and pin it to the piece, attach it to the piece in some way, then step back far enough so that when you put your hand up in front of your face, you can no longer see that part. Now drop your hand. Is the piece better now that you can see that color or texture? If not, don't add it. So that was a takeaway. And then a friend looked at a piece of mine that I was actually giving him and said he loved it because it was still breathing. And that a lot of the pieces I had done before that weren't, that I had worked it too long, I'd gone too far. And so that whole idea of a piece still breathing is something that I kind of carry with me. And I want the pieces to still be breathing when I'm done.
Ooh, Nolan.
I don't know that they always are, but that's an aspiration.
That's what you strive to. I love that. The piece is still breathing. That's, see, very, very smart. I like it. Let's pull up, let's look at counterpoint. Ooh, see, look at this, lovely. All right, Nolan, walk us through this one.
So this was another one of, this was relatively early. This was the first piece I did with color.
Oh, wow, really?
No, the second. I guess I did color study first.
Okay.
This one, the dye bath was multiple colors so that when you can't see it too well in this image, but the stitching threads change color. And when you
like an ombre?
The cord used for the stitching of the bottom piece of the greenish piece.
Yeah. Nice.
The thread for the stitching, the wax linen that I used for the stitching, I altered the color and vary it, which draws out different colors from the pine needles. And it was this was early enough that I was still very much just seeing what I could do physically. So this was I'm going to do a circle start. I want to do an absolutely perfect circle. I'm going to do a vertical step up, and then a slight ramp, and then a vertical step up, and then a slight ramp, and then a vertical step up, and another slight ramp. And I did it, and it was symmetrical, and it was beautiful. And I looked at it and went, okay, now I need to do something to it. And I saw the biomorphic shapes, and I literally sketched them in place with the needles. And the color, so these are coiled in place by just taking and starting with a bunch of needles, tacking them to an existing stitch, and then curving the needle, tacking to the next stitch and to the next stitch and the next stitch, and curving it around and moving, and then building on that line, leaning in or leaning out to get the shape. And the color you see, these are undyed needles.
Really?
Shapes are undyed needles. All that color is by just changing the color of the thread used for the stitching. And adding the biomorphic shapes, the torque, the stress of coiling in place distorted that perfect symmetrical base. So it wasn't just adding a shape on top of something that remained static, it altered it.
Yeah, it has great movement to it, Nolan. I think there's just it's so interesting. Like you can just stare at it for, a very long time and always see something different, which is a sign of a great piece.
Thank you.
Very, very nice. Well, thank you for walking us through that. That was great. Can you tell us a little bit about what's next for you? What's coming up?
Well, I mentioned the gallery owners. So I have a gallery show coming up. I had some gallery shows years ago, back in the 70s when I was doing wall hangings and things. I've submitted pieces, my pine needle pieces and knotted and foil pieces to a number of exhibits, juried exhibits, but I haven't been in any galleries. I haven't even tried. And so I'm going to have a small gallery show in September in Columbia. So I'm looking toward that.
This is South Carolina, right? Columbia, South Carolina.
South Carolina. I'm working on that piece I mentioned that grew out of the pieces that I had originally intended for unexpected growth. And they are a first experiment with assemblage. So I'm doing a number of separate pieces. I'm trying some new techniques and then having them either they're going to be on a shared base. They're the first time I've done anything with a superstructure, so they each have a brass rod that each piece had already been executed, and then I bent the brass rod to match the shape and attached it, and then did knotting over that. And so those allow it to then be attached to a base. And I'm seeing what those different forms, how they'll relate to each other, whether they'll actually touch. So that'll be a new thing. So it's experimenting. What else? I'm just continuing to work and see what I can do, what the material can do, what I can come up with to do with the techniques and the material, what my body will cooperate with doing.
Sure.
I had been looking forward to retiring. I was a law librarian. At a university.
Oh, wow.
So I had been teaching legal research and running the public service side of the library and loved doing that and working as a reference librarian. But I was doing the pieces on the side and looking forward to the day where I could work on the art full time. And then we moved and I thought, okay, now I get to do that. But first, a torn shoulder, and then an arm tremble that the doctors ended up determining was Parkinson's. And so, part of what's going on when you say, well, what's next? It's continuing to work, but learning what my body will do. Moving the arms is good.
Yeah.
Keeping moving is really important with Parkinson's. But it's like, well, how much? How many hours a day? How long at a stint? Something, and just learning to accept that some things are more difficult. Threading a needle, when one hand is shaking, it doesn't matter which hand you're working with. If one hand is shaking and you're trying to thread a needle, that's an interesting experience. And it's one that I have multiple times a day. And it's just, that's part of what life is now.
Yeah.
So, and I'm bringing this, I'm mentioning this because I decided ahead of this, but I was going to, that I wanted to normalize it, that, getting older, bodies change, and that's part of it. And so you can gnash your teeth about it, or you can open up to it and go, okay, well, what can I do with the space that I have, with the body that I have, with the time that I have? If I can add one little bit to that, part of that was a takeaway from Lenore Towney, who some of the listeners I hope will recognize. Wonderful weaver. And I listened to a presentation she did about a show that was up at James Madison University, of all places, in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. in Harrisonburg, Virginia, because she had family near there. And it was these incredible pieces that looked like, if you've ever seen rain from a distance, you just see the lines coming down and they don't all, they're all end at the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these were 20, 30 feet wide, hanging from a high ceiling in a museum.
Yeah.
She had never seen them until they were installed.
Wow.
She had a very nice loft space. She lost that loft, and she was having to adapt to what she could do on her kitchen table in her apartment. And so she had grown up seeing those images of the rain, and she thought, someday I want to do something about that. And so she designed a piece that she could execute that would accomplish that by taking fabric sheets, doing a grid, marking a grid with a dot X number of inches apart. And then she cut lengths of material of different kinds of thread that would shimmer or not shimmer. Some would reflect light, some wouldn't. There were different lengths, and then she would coil them around her finger and tie them off and attach them to each one of the dots. And then the piece was delivered, suspended from the ceiling. All those loop bits of thread were untied and allowed to dangle. And that's when she saw it for the first time.
Wow. Amazing.
Okay. Yes. And this from somebody who, I cannot remember the name of the piece that she did, but touched off such a furor. She submitted a piece for a craft show. And it was at a location where there were two shows being juried, a fine art show and a craft show. And she had this piece that was a form, like a figure, coming away from the fabric, hanging against the fabric. And the piece was rejected as too painterly by the craft jury. And the story I heard anyway, or read, was that the piece was in the reject pile. And one of the jurors from the fine art exhibit walked by, saw it, and took it.
Yeah.
And put it in the fine art exhibit. And all hell broke loose.
Love that.
And if somebody who, I mean, this was a historic thing.
Yeah.
And, and this was somebody who was in, world-renowned weaver. She got to a point where she couldn't do what she was known for. She didn't stop.
Yeah. So inspiring.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Well,
No,
and thank you.
I didn't come up with this on my own. I was inspired, and I mentioned this with the hopes that maybe it inspires others.
Absolutely. And it absolutely will, Nolan. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes.
Okay.
I say, how about we, how about we jump in and see about some questions from our viewers? Let's see what we've got here. Okay. Let's see. Sarah asked, what do you use to dye? Like, what materials do you use to dye your,
I use RIT dye. I use RIT fabric dye. I've tried.
Okay.
I've tried fiber reactive dye. I read everything I could find on the web about using it with reed, because it'll work with reed if you do it the right way, with fixative the right way.
Okay.
It doesn't work with pine needle. They don't take on the color.
It won't absorb it.
The caps will take on a little bit of color, but the needles themselves won't.
Interesting. I like that. Let's see. Karen asked, she says she loves your work. Can you talk about any other fibers you use in your pieces, if you use them? And how do you combine pine needles to get a thicker or thinner piece? That's a good question, Karen.
The pine needles, it's just how many clusters you use in a course. And
that's how you adjust the density.
Yeah, to adjust the thickness of the course. And there are a lot of pine needle people that are meticulous about having the course never change the thickness, and they feed the bundle is the term. I don't worry about that. I don't worry about my stitches being exactly even. I'll make things go from very thin at one part of the basket to very thick where I want to build shape, or versus where I want to have a tight turn. If I want to make a tight turn, I don't want to have it too thick.
That makes sense. You want it a little more flexible.
Right, but I soak the needles before I use them. And there are people that say never use wet needles, but what they really mean or should mean is you don't work with green needles, fresh needles that haven't dried, because they will shrink and then the basket will be loose. But if you are working with dried needles, you're going to get splinters, first of all.
Ow.
Unless you soak them with glycerin, and I don't like the texture you end up with. It leaves a plastic coating, a plastic feel kind of coating of stickiness. And so to be able to bend and to cut down on the splinters, I soak the needles. I use waxed linen for most of the stitching. And I get most of that from, well, I guess we shouldn't mention names of companies or anything. Most people that work with basketry know, but there's a primary supplier of waxed linen. But I also found a supplier from Lithuania that has 1-ply, 2-ply, 3-ply, and 4-ply by the pound, unwaxed, and like 60 colors. So more colors than I've ever found anywhere. And then I wax them myself, or I wax them with my friend Clay Burnett, who lives here in Columbia as well. And so Clay and I both get from that supplier. Is that just, so that expands the color range, but then I also use Linohosta, well, that's a brand. I use wax polycord, Brazilian polycord. I've used wools, I've used other materials. With the knotting, I've worked with every kind of material you could think of. I used to get leather scraps, suede scraps, and cut them into strips and knot with the suede. I've worked with wire, but with the pine needles, I finish with a beeswax and paraffin, melted paraffin beeswax coat that I brush on, and then use a heat gun to absorb into the needles, which leaves the piece with a texture almost like petrified wood.
Oh, nice.
And the form, the shape, when you touch the sides, it doesn't have a give like you might think a basket would have. And that will darken material. So like wool or cotton, the color changes dramatically.
Oh, wow.
When you add the wax. So I'm sticking primarily to the colored wire, the waxed poly, and the waxed linen for the stitching and for the knotting.
Yeah, wonderful. I know we had a couple questions about details about your exhibit. Do you know, can you give the gallery name or the dates? Do you have some of that information you can share?
The gallery? I'm sorry. I cheated a Q&A, something popped up in the Q&A. I forgot to turn off the updates or the live updates or whatever, and something popped up and diverted my attention. You're asking about the gallery show?
Yeah, I had a couple folks that asked about where the gallery show will be, any details, dates, that kind of stuff in Columbia.
Sure. It's opening September 21st at Mike Brown Gallery.
Mike Brown, okay.
Mike Brown Gallery, and I don't have a closing date yet.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Nolan. This has really been wonderful. And I love hearing about your process, about how you take on your art form. It's really inspiring. Thank you.
I hope we didn't leave too many people with questions unanswered because of my going on at length in my answers.
No, that's all right. And I am sure that if they want to find more information and reach out, they can find you. They
absolutely can.
Yeah. Okay. How wonderful. Well, thank you, Nolan. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You can learn more about Nolan and his work on his website at nolanwrightbasketry.com. I'd like to give a special thank you to the Olympia Weavers Guild for sponsoring today's episode of Textiles and Tea. If you would like to sponsor an episode of Textiles and Tea, you can learn more at weavespindye.org. Textiles and Tea is supported by generous donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, please support HGA by becoming a member or donating. You can join and give on our website at weavespindye.org. If you missed any part of this episode and would like to watch it again or share it with a friend, Textiles and Tea is recorded and can be viewed on HGA's Facebook page, or subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can view the entire series and more. Please join Kathy next week when she shares tea with Karen Baker. Thank you and happy tea.